The forest in Mineral, Washington is the kind of place that feels endless. Towering evergreens blot out the sun, the roads are so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat, and the air carries that cold, damp smell of pine needles and rain-soaked earth. To outsiders, it looks peaceful, a little too peaceful. But in the summer of 1985, that silence would become unbearable, because it started to hide a darkness no one could explain. It began with a couple who simply wanted to escape. Stephen Harkins and Ruth Cooper were ordinary people in search of something extraordinary. Stephen, a teacher with a steady voice and calm demeanor, and Ruth, a spirited woman with a love for adventure, had packed up their things for a weekend camping trip in July. They wanted a little time away from the grind, a little quiet, a little romance, and the kind of freedom only a Washington forest could offer. They never made it back. When the weekend passed and there was no word, friends weren't alarmed at first. After all, this was the 1980s. No cell phones, no constant check-ins. But when days turned into silence, a search began. And what they found wasn't just disturbing, it was grotesque. Stephen was discovered inside his sleeping bag at a campsite near Tacoma. He had been shot in the head. Ruth's fate was even worse. She wasn't found until 2 months later, her body dumped in the brush near Mineral. The details were enough to curdle the blood of even the most seasoned investigators. She had been shot, her remains partially decomposed, and around her neck, tied snug like some twisted bow, was a tube sock. A tube sock. It was such an ordinary thing. Innocent. Harmless. Something you'd see in every laundry basket, in every home across America. And yet here it was, transformed into a calling card. Whoever had killed Ruth wanted the world to notice that detail. He wanted investigators to remember it. The sheriff's office scrambled. Was this just a random act of violence? Was it a drifter, a hunter gone mad, a robbery gone wrong? Or was it something much darker, the beginning of a pattern? Locals were terrified, though not everyone admitted it. This was logging country, a region defined by tough men with chainsaws and boots, people who prided themselves on minding their own business. But behind closed doors, families whispered, who could do something like that? And why here, in their backyard? The news rippled through Pierce and Lewis counties. Newspapers buried the story between logging strikes and political scandals, but the community knew better. They had seen what the forest could hide. And then, it happened again. But before we rush forward, let's pause on what Stephen and Ruth's murders meant. In the mid-80s, serial killers weren't a novelty in Washington state. This was the land of Ted Bundy, the Green River Killer, and a frightening list of predators who seemed to find fertile hunting ground in the Pacific Northwest. Yet this felt different. Bundy thrived on charm. The Green River Killer preyed on vulnerable women. But this? Couples. Ordinary couples. Murdered in places meant for escape, relaxation, and love. It felt like someone was mocking the very idea of safety. Even the investigators disagreed on what they were looking at. Some believed the tube sock was a symbol, perhaps sexual in nature, a kind of ritual meant to degrade the victims. Others suggested it was simply practical. The killer used what he had on hand to control or strangle. But if it was merely practical, why repeat it? Why leave it like a signature, a haunting little bow tied in white cotton? The authorities didn't say much. In fact, they said very little at all, a silence that some believed was intentional. Was it incompetence, or something worse? When cases go cold, it's one thing. But when cases feel like they're being smothered, details hushed up, evidence brushed aside, that's when rumors start to spread. And spread they did. Some locals whispered about a hunter who had a violent temper. Others spoke about strange sightings, cars parked on back roads at odd hours, headlights suddenly switched off when another driver passed by. There was even talk of law enforcement connections, as if the investigation was never meant to succeed. What we do know is that by the time Ruth Cooper's body was recovered, fear had taken root. Women clutched their keys tighter, men loaded their rifles by the door, and parents warned their children not to wander too far. The forest, once a refuge, was now a place of suspicion. The killings of Stephen and Ruth could have been dismissed as a tragic one-off, a horrific act of random violence. But what came next made sure of one thing: there was nothing random about it. This was a pattern. This was deliberate. And it was only just beginning. In August of that same year, another couple would meet a fate that tied the murders together in a way no one could ignore. And again, the clue would be simple, ridiculous, and unforgettable: a tube sock. The quiet town of Mineral had no idea it was about to become the center of one of Washington's darkest and most enduring mysteries. The story of Stephen Harkins and Ruth Cooper could have ended as a tragic headline. A double murder, a bizarre detail, another case filed away in Washington's already crowded cabinets of unsolved crimes. But the nightmare didn't stop there. What came next proved that the killings weren't just isolated tragedies, they were a pattern. A chilling, deliberate pattern. It was December 12, 1985, when 36-year-old Mike Reimer and 21-year-old Diana Robertson decided to take a day trip. They were a young couple, parents to a 2-year-old daughter named Crystal, and they wanted to spend the afternoon together in the woods. Mike was a roofer, hardworking, quiet, known for being reliable. Diana was younger, a free spirit in many ways, though her life wasn't without struggle. The two had their ups and downs, but at the end of the day, they were building a family. That December morning, they bundled little Crystal into the truck and set off for the Nisqually River area, not far from Mineral, the same region where Ruth Cooper's body had been found. They never came home. Hours later, a driver on a remote road spotted something strange: a red pickup truck, abandoned, engine off. Inside, sitting in the passenger seat, was a toddler. Alone. Crystal was there, wide-eyed, terrified, and completely silent. She had been left for hours, perhaps the entire day. Beside her, there was no sign of her parents. Just emptiness. The scene was haunting in its simplicity. A truck. A toddler. No blood, no immediate struggle. But the silence of the woods screamed louder than anything. Where were Mike and Diana? And why would any parent abandon a child in the middle of nowhere? Police descended on the scene, trying to piece together what had happened. In the cab of the truck, they found a slip of paper smeared in blood. Written in large, almost frantic scrawl, were the words, "I love you, Diana." That note became the most controversial piece of evidence in the case. To some, it was a desperate final message from Mike, a man about to take his own life or confess to something terrible. To others, it was a planted clue, a red herring meant to incriminate him. For weeks, there was no trace of either adult. Theories swirled. Had Mike snapped, killed Diana, and fled into the woods, leaving his daughter behind? Or had they both fallen victim to the same monster who had slaughtered Stephen and Ruth just months before? The truth emerged in fragments, months later. On February 18, 1986, hikers discovered the partially decomposed body of Diana Robertson in a patch of brush near Mineral. The scene was grim. She had been stabbed repeatedly. And around her neck, just as with Ruth Cooper, was a tube sock. The pattern was undeniable now. The forests of Pierce and Lewis counties weren't hiding random killings. They were hiding a hunter. Someone stalking couples, dragging them into the shadows, and leaving behind the same grotesque signature, the tube sock. But where was Mike? Search teams combed the woods, hunting for any sign of him. Some believed he had killed Diana, tied the sock around her neck to mimic the earlier murders, and then fled. Others insisted he had been killed too, his body hidden more carefully. But no trace of him was found. Not then. Not for years. Meanwhile, Crystal, the couple's abandoned daughter, became the face of the case. Newspapers plastered her picture everywhere, the wide-eyed child left behind in the woods, the only witness who might have seen what really happened that day. But she was only 2 years old. Too young to remember. Too young to explain. And perhaps, some argued, too dangerous a witness to keep alive, if the killer knew she had seen something. The scandal grew. Some in the community pointed fingers directly at Mike, claiming the bloodied note was proof of guilt. Others argued it was absurd to think a man would murder his partner, stab her brutally, tie a sock around her neck, and then abandon his toddler unharmed in the front seat of his own truck. If Mike was guilty, why leave the one person who could connect him to the crime? That question lingered like smoke in the trees. By now, panic was spreading across Pierce and Lewis counties. The papers began to connect the dots publicly, whispering the phrase that would become infamous, the tube sock killings. Families stopped camping. Couples avoided the woods. Even seasoned hunters carried a different kind of fear with them into the forests, glancing over their shoulders, ears straining for footsteps that weren't theirs. Investigators were stuck between two competing nightmares. Was there a serial killer hunting couples in the Pacific Northwest? Or had Mike Reimer snapped and staged the scene? The lack of answers only fueled the paranoia. If it was a serial killer, he was brilliant at disappearing, melting into the trees after each strike. If it was Mike, then where was he? His body hadn't been found, his face was still out there, and his daughter's haunting silence only made the mystery more unbearable. And the sock, that stupid, ordinary sock, had transformed from a harmless item of clothing into the most chilling symbol in Washington's true crime history. The trail of bodies was undeniable now. Harkins and Cooper. Reimer and Robertson. 4 lives ended in brutality, 1 man missing, and a child abandoned to silence. And the forests of Mineral, Washington, had become something far worse than a quiet getaway. They had become a hunting ground. But if investigators thought the terror would end there, they were wrong. Because soon, the question of Mike Reimer's disappearance would explode into one of the most controversial debates in the history of Washington crime. By early 1986, the forests of Pierce and Lewis counties were no longer places of comfort. They were crime scenes. Every trailhead, every lonely dirt road, every patch of trees felt like it could be hiding a body. People who once walked the woods with pride, hunters, loggers, campers, families, now walked with fear, if they walked at all. It wasn't just the murders themselves. It was the style of the murders. Couples. Always couples. It wasn't a random mugging or a spur-of-the-moment act of violence. It was planned, cold, and deliberate. Someone out there was hunting pairs of people the way other men hunted deer. And the police didn't seem to know what to do. In rural towns, law enforcement was a small operation. A handful of deputies, a sheriff's office stretched thin across miles of forest roads, logging trails, and isolated cabins. They weren't used to serial killers. They were used to bar fights, domestic disputes, the occasional theft of logging equipment. Murder was rare. Multiple murders, staged in the same twisted fashion, were something altogether alien. But if the authorities were struggling, the public didn't see their confusion as innocence. They saw it as indifference, or worse, incompetence. They don't want to admit there's a serial killer, one local told reporters, his voice shaking with anger. If they say it out loud, then everyone knows the truth, we're not safe. That was the scandal bubbling under the surface. Officials hesitated to declare a serial killer on the loose. Why? Because doing so would cripple tourism, scare off hunters, and send logging crews into a panic. It wasn't just about fear. It was about money. And money, as the locals whispered, always seemed to speak louder than justice. At night, conversations in bars and diners turned into strategy sessions. Men who had never worried about walking alone through the timber now swore they wouldn't leave without a shotgun. Mothers refused to let their teenage daughters drive out to the woods to meet boyfriends. Couples canceled camping trips they had planned for months. The forest was no longer a place of escape. It was a trap. As the months dragged on, the rumors multiplied. Some said it had to be a drifter, someone hopping between towns, living off scraps, preying on whoever was unlucky enough to cross his path. Others argued it had to be a local, someone who knew the backroads too well to ever be caught. After all, who else could vanish so easily into the pines? And then there were the darker whispers, that maybe the killer was law enforcement itself. That theory wasn't born from paranoia alone. The sheriff's office had already made a mess of the early investigation, losing track of evidence, miscommunicating with neighboring jurisdictions, and keeping certain findings eerily quiet. To some, the silence looked less like incompetence and more like a cover-up. "Who knows the woods better than the deputies?" one man asked a reporter. "They're out there all the time. They know where to hide." It was a shocking accusation, but the fear was real. People had seen too much already: the tube socks, the abandoned toddler, the missing husband. Nothing added up, and when nothing adds up, suspicion fills the void. Even the federal government began to take notice. The FBI, already busy tracking serial killers across the country in the 1980s, started quietly consulting on the case. But even with their involvement, there were no clear suspects, no forensic breakthroughs, no answers. The murders hung in the air like fog, dense, suffocating, impossible to escape. The one thread that tied the crimes together was the sock. That stupid, ordinary tube sock. It was the kind of thing every household had lying around. In a logging town, where boots were worn daily, tube socks were practically a uniform. That was the part that made people's skin crawl. The killer wasn't leaving behind an exotic symbol or some obscure piece of ritual paraphernalia. He was leaving behind something so common, so normal, that it became terrifying. If a tube sock could become a murder weapon, then anything could. The sense of dread deepened with every month the case went unsolved. Hunters began reporting strange encounters, a figure in the woods that didn't belong, a car parked at odd hours, the sense of being watched. Most of these reports led nowhere, but each one was whispered about in town like proof of the killer's existence. And then came the copycats. A handful of assaults and strange crimes across Washington were suddenly being linked, fairly or not, to the tube sock killer. Was it paranoia? Or was the killer expanding his hunting grounds? No one knew for sure, but the press ran with it. The nickname stuck. The tube sock killer. Once the papers had a label, it was over. The story spread far beyond Mineral, drawing the attention of Seattle news crews, national crime shows, and even amateur sleuths who came to the area hoping to solve the mystery themselves. Mineral, a quiet town built on logging and fishing, suddenly had a new identity, the backdrop for a serial killer saga. And the more the press covered it, the more pressure built on law enforcement. Families of the victims demanded answers. Locals demanded protection. And still, nothing. The case files grew thicker, the interviews piled up, but the killer remained a ghost. A ghost with tube socks. By the end of 1986, the murders had transformed Mineral and its neighbors. Trust in law enforcement had eroded. Suspicion was tearing the community apart. Everyone had a theory, and no one had peace of mind. The pine forests that had once been a sanctuary now loomed over the towns like a curse. And yet, the darkest scandal of all was still to come. Because while the community raged at law enforcement for their failures, another question simmered beneath it all. What if the killer wasn't a stranger at all? What if the man everyone feared had been with Diana that day in the truck? What if Mike Reimer, the husband, the father, the roofer, wasn't a victim, but the tube sock killer himself? The panic in the pines was only the beginning. The vanishing husband would soon ignite a firestorm of controversy that still burns to this day. By the winter of 1985, the so-called tube sock killer was already haunting the people of Pierce and Lewis counties. But when Diana Robertson's body was discovered in February 1986, tied to the now infamous tube sock, a new kind of shadow fell across the investigation. This time, the terror didn't point to a stranger lurking in the woods. It pointed to someone much closer. Her partner. Mike Reimer. At first, the disappearance of Mike looked like part of the pattern. Just as Stephen Harkins and Ruth Cooper had been taken, so too had Diana and Mike. Diana was murdered, stabbed repeatedly, her life snuffed out with brutal force. Mike, however, had vanished without a trace. And in his truck, next to his terrified 2-year-old daughter, sat the bloody note, "I love you, Diana." Was it a confession? A goodbye? Or the cruel handiwork of a killer who wanted to frame him? The sheriff's office didn't say. They didn't need to. The community filled in the silence with their own theories, and soon the whispers became shouts. Mike killed her. It was scandalous. Neighbors remembered arguments between the couple, little flare-ups that, in hindsight, now looked sinister. Some said Mike had a temper. Others swore he was quiet and gentle. But gossip is powerful, and in a town already suffocating from fear, the idea that Diana's own partner had turned on her was irresistible. There was, after all, motive to be imagined. Mike was older, burdened by financial stress, raising a toddler, and struggling to make ends meet as a roofer. Diana, younger, restless, with her whole life ahead of her. Did resentment boil over into murder? Did he stab her in rage, then scrawl his guilty little love note before vanishing into the woods? The press loved it. Headlines shifted from "Mystery Killer Stalks Forest" to "Husband Vanishes After Lover's Murder." The narrative was cleaner this way. Instead of a ghostly serial killer haunting the pine forests, the story became a domestic tragedy, ugly, violent, but explainable. A man snapped. A woman died. The public could close the book. Except it wasn't that simple. First, there was Crystal. Their 2-year-old daughter, left unharmed in the truck. If Mike had truly murdered Diana, why leave the one witness, however small, alive? Why not take her, hide her, do something? No father leaves his toddler alone in the woods in winter unless something went terribly wrong. Second, there was the sock. If this was just a domestic murder, why mimic the earlier case of Ruth Cooper? Why tie a sock around Diana's neck? It was too specific, too deliberate. It looked staged. Almost theatrical. Third, there was the note. "I love you, Diana." Written in blood. Investigators never released whose blood it was, or how much of it. Some believed it wasn't Mike's writing at all, just a plant. But others argued that it was exactly the kind of desperate message a guilty man might leave when he realized he couldn't cover his tracks. And then came the biggest problem of all: Mike was gone. No body. No sign of life. For months, then years, then decades, his absence became both the strongest piece of evidence against him, and the strongest piece of evidence for his innocence. If he was guilty, where was he hiding? How could a man just vanish forever? And if he was innocent, where was his body? Why hadn't he been found, like all the others, in some patch of brush along a logging road? The theories split the community in two. One side saw Mike as the killer. They painted him as a man driven to the edge, who murdered Diana in a jealous rage, abandoned his daughter, and fled into the wilderness to start a new life under a new name. "He's out there somewhere," they said. "Living in Alaska. Living in Canada. Anywhere but here." The other side saw him as a victim. They believed Mike had been taken alongside Diana, murdered in the same way as Stephen Harkins had been. They argued his body simply hadn't been discovered yet, hidden deeper, covered better, or perhaps dumped far from the original scene. This divide wasn't just gossip. It poisoned the investigation itself. Instead of pooling resources to hunt a serial killer, law enforcement leaned into the theory that Mike was guilty. Why chase a phantom in the woods when the killer's name was already written on the case file? And yet, for all their suspicions, investigators couldn't prove it. They couldn't find him. As the years stretched on, Mike's absence became a scandal of its own. The Reimer and Robertson families lived in torment, trapped between grief and suspicion. Diana's loved ones wanted justice, but justice required a conviction, and Mike wasn't there to stand trial. Mike's relatives, meanwhile, begged people to believe he was innocent, another victim of the tube sock killer, his body simply lost to the wilderness. The press feasted on the ambiguity. Every anniversary of the case brought fresh speculation. Every interview with Crystal, who grew up with the shadow of her parents' tragedy, reignited the question: did her father kill her mother, or was he murdered too? What no one could deny was this: the killings had fractured the community. The monster in the woods was terrifying, yes. But the idea that the killer might have been Diana's own partner, a man who ate breakfast in the same diners, bought supplies in the same stores, and waved at neighbors as he drove past, that was worse. That was intimate. That was scandalous. And it left people wondering if the real danger wasn't the stranger lurking in the trees, but the man sleeping beside you in your own home. The vanishing husband was more than a mystery. He was a symbol of everything people feared most: betrayal, secrecy, and the terrifying possibility that evil doesn't always wear the face of a stranger. Sometimes it wears the face of the one you trust the most. But if Mike was the killer, why didn't law enforcement ever find him? And if he wasn't, why did the murders stop? Unless, of course, they didn't. By the mid-1980s, the forests of Pierce and Lewis counties were no longer just haunted by the killings themselves. They were haunted by suspicion that the authorities, the very people charged with protecting the community, might be hiding something. The story of the tube sock killer had already captured national attention. Newspapers, radio shows, and even true crime aficionados were fascinated by the bizarre signature of the socks, the abandoned toddler, and the vanished husband. But amid the headlines, murmurs began circulating, whispers of corruption, cover-ups, and mishandled evidence that would turn a horrifying story into a full-blown scandal. It began with missing evidence. Investigators would later admit, quietly, that key pieces of the Diana Robertson case had vanished from the sheriff's office. Files, photographs, even witness statements disappeared or were delayed for months. For families and amateur sleuths poring over the case, it looked like negligence at best, and intentional sabotage at worst. Some theorists didn't stop there. They began suggesting that perhaps law enforcement had reason to protect the killer. After all, who knew the remote logging roads better than the locals, or the deputies patrolling them? And who had the authority to move freely through the woods without raising suspicion? The idea was incendiary. To suggest that someone in uniform might have been involved, even tangentially, sent shockwaves through the small towns surrounding Mineral. And then there were the rumors about drugs. In the mid-1980s, the Pacific Northwest had pockets of illicit activity, marijuana growing operations tucked into hidden valleys, smuggling routes running along forest roads, and shady figures who operated in plain sight. Locals began speculating that the victims may have stumbled onto something they shouldn't have. Perhaps Stephen and Ruth, or Diana and Mike, had crossed paths with criminal activity in the woods. Perhaps they had been punished. The theory was simple, but horrifying. The murders weren't random acts of passion or a serial killer's whim. They were calculated, and possibly sanctioned by people in power. Some townspeople whispered that deputies themselves had known more than they admitted. The Reimer family was convinced of it. They pointed to the lack of follow-up on Mike's disappearance, the slow response to Diana's body, and the strange gaps in official reports. How, they asked, could a father vanish entirely, and yet no one had even a hint of where to look? It didn't help that the local media was cautious, almost timid. Some reporters claimed they had been pressured by law enforcement to tone it down, to avoid implying a cover-up. Others claimed their sources simply went silent after making explosive statements. Every lead seemed to vanish just when it was about to expose something significant. Then there was the question of the pattern itself. Why were couples being targeted? And why did the tube sock become the signature? Some conspiracy theorists suggested it was a ritualistic warning, a way to mark victims who had stumbled onto the wrong activities, drug operations, corrupt officials, or even illicit logging schemes. In this reading, the murders were messages, not random acts of murder. The forest became a stage, and the tube sock, the symbol. This line of thinking was controversial, even among true crime enthusiasts. Many dismissed it as paranoia. But the timing and location of the killings were hard to ignore. Mineral, and the surrounding areas, were isolated enough that illicit activity could remain hidden, yet accessible enough that outsiders occasionally saw something strange. The ultimate scandal, however, came from what didn't happen. Investigators never officially connected the dots between the Harkins case, the Robertson case, or the rumored illicit operations in the woods. Files went missing, interviews were incomplete, and leads went cold. The public began to speculate, what if this wasn't incompetence, but deliberate obfuscation? What if the investigation had been sabotaged to protect someone powerful, someone who could manipulate the sheriff's office? By the late 1980s, the conspiracies had become as famous as the killings themselves. Theories abounded. That Mike Reimer had been silenced because he discovered a drug operation. That the tube sock killer had inside knowledge of law enforcement patrols, allowing him to strike and vanish without trace. That deputies intentionally misled the investigation, either out of fear, complicity, or corruption. Every rumor, every whisper, added layers to the story. What had started as a simple, if gruesome, mystery of missing couples transformed into something far darker, a town riddled with fear, suspicion, and unanswered questions. Even today, skeptics argue that the true horror of the tube sock killings wasn't just the murders. It was the possibility that the killer may have had help, or at least protection. It was the knowledge that evidence had gone missing, witnesses had disappeared, and authorities may have turned a blind eye. And in the forests of Mineral, where sunlight barely touches the forest floor and every rustle could be footsteps, the sense of dread lingered. People no longer wondered simply who killed these couples. They wondered who else might be involved. Who else was hiding in plain sight, watching, waiting. By now, the case had transcended the forest itself. It had become a story of corruption, secrecy, and betrayal, a case that asked one horrifying question above all others. In a town like Mineral, could anyone be trusted? The tube sock killer, whoever he was, remained at large. But the real scandal may have been the silence around him, the missing evidence, and the suspicion that someone in a position of power, had allowed him to continue. And as the forest grew still under the shadow of the pines, the people of Pierce and Lewis counties began to understand the truth. Sometimes, the most dangerous predators aren't the ones hiding in the woods. They're the ones in uniform, in positions of authority, with the power to erase mistakes, and to hide the sins of others. By the late 1980s, the Pacific Northwest had come to associate the phrase, tube sock killer, with fear itself. The murders in Pierce and Lewis counties weren't just remembered for their brutality, they were remembered for the bizarre, haunting signature left behind at the scenes, a simple, white tube sock tied around the victims' necks. It was a detail so mundane, so unassuming, that it became almost surreal. Ordinary clothing had become an instrument of terror. And in small towns like Mineral, where people wore tube socks every day, the thought that such a harmless item could become a marker of death was enough to make even seasoned loggers shiver. The investigators, perplexed from the very beginning, debated the significance of the sock endlessly. Some saw it as a practical tool, used to restrain or strangle victims, but that theory never fully accounted for the repeated use. Every time, the sock was carefully placed. It wasn't random. It wasn't an afterthought. It was a calling card, a deliberate message from the killer. Others began to speculate that the tube sock carried a symbolic weight. Could it represent purity, innocence, or domesticity? Was the killer mocking the ordinary, turning everyday items into instruments of horror? Or was it a ritual, some private obsession manifested in a way that investigators could never understand? For true crime enthusiasts and law enforcement alike, the repetition was what made it terrifying. When Stephen Harkins and Ruth Cooper were found, the sock seemed like an anomaly, bizarre but potentially meaningless. When Diana Robertson was discovered months later, the pattern became undeniable. The killer wasn't improvising, he was deliberate. Each crime scene was meticulously staged, each victim selected and attacked with precision. The tube sock wasn't just a signature, it was the signature. Even small details about the socks themselves became part of the puzzle. They were almost always plain white, ordinary cotton, worn but clean. No logos, no patterns. Just simple, everyday socks. The mundane nature of the item was what made it chilling. It was the kind of object anyone could overlook. In this way, the killer reminded the townspeople of a horrifying truth: evil could hide in plain sight. Psychologists and profilers later weighed in, offering theories that added a layer of dark fascination to the case. Some suggested that the sock represented a perverse form of intimacy, a twisted imprint of the killer's obsession with domestic life. Others thought it was meant to shame the victims, a small, humiliating detail imposed after the act of murder. And yet, no matter the interpretation, the pattern was consistent. The socks linked the murders in a way that forensic evidence often couldn't. Different towns, different victims, and the signature remained the same. In criminal profiling, a repeating signature often points to organized, methodical behavior, someone who kills with control, precision, and psychological intent. The tube sock killer, whoever he was, wasn't a brute. He was a planner. A shadow in the forests of Washington, always calculating, always deliberate. The pattern also sparked an unsettling question: was this the work of a single person, or could someone else be mimicking the crimes? Copycats have appeared in other serial killer cases, but here, there was no deviation. The socks were always the same. That consistency suggested one mind behind all the killings, one killer whose reach and cunning extended across the isolated forests without leaving a trace. Law enforcement attempted to compare the tube sock murders to other unsolved cases in Washington and Oregon. Similar patterns emerged: a couple killed in the woods, ordinary objects used in strangulation, but nothing matched the precision or the symbolic sock detail. The killer's signature remained unique. Even subtle humor crept in among investigators and locals, a coping mechanism against the horror. Who knew socks could be so dangerous? People joked nervously in the cafes of Mineral. But the joke didn't last long. The socks were never just socks. They were a reminder that terror could be intimate, domestic, and eerily familiar. Some theorists even argued that the socks were a message to law enforcement, a way of mocking investigators. The killer knew the attention a simple object could draw. By leaving behind the same signature, he wasn't just marking his victims, he was playing a game, taunting authorities, and showing that he could strike anywhere, anytime, without being caught. This theory gained traction when investigators noticed one more detail: the socks weren't always tied in the same knot. Sometimes they were knotted tightly, sometimes loosely, sometimes draped almost casually. Each variation seemed to carry its own subtle meaning, as if the killer were sending a code. The community, terrified and fascinated, began to imagine the possibilities. Was the killer leaving messages for the next victim? Or for the detectives, daring them to understand? For years, the tube sock signature became a symbol not just of the killer, but of the mystery itself. It was the link between murders, the thread that connected victims across time and space. And for a town like Mineral, it was the tangible evidence that something monstrous had walked among them, leaving behind ordinary items twisted into a statement of fear. And still, despite years of investigation, despite rumors, conspiracy theories, and thousands of tips, the killer remained elusive. The forests of Pierce and Lewis counties kept their secrets, and the tube socks, simple, white, ordinary, continued to haunt the memories of everyone who had ever heard the story. The signature wasn't just a clue. It was a haunting promise. The killer could strike again, and when he did, it would be exactly the same. Methodical. Precise. Terrifying. By the time investigators had traced the pattern fully, they realized something even more chilling. The tube sock killer had already embedded himself into the psyche of the townspeople. Every walk in the woods, every abandoned road, every rustle of leaves carried a reminder of the socks, and the man, or men, behind them. In the end, the tube sock wasn't just a tool or a token. It was a signature. A calling card. And a warning that the forests of Washington could never be fully trusted again. Years had passed since Diana Robertson's brutal murder and Mike Reimer's disappearance. The forests of Pierce and Lewis counties, once alive with the normal hum of logging and wildlife, had grown quiet in a way that was unnatural. The shadows seemed heavier. Hunters avoided old trails. Locals spoke of strange sightings, a figure glimpsed between trees, a flicker of movement where no one should have been. The legend of the tube sock killer had become a ghost story whispered to children, a reminder that terror could be patient and invisible. Then, in the summer of 1992, nearly 7 years after Mike Reimer vanished, a hiker stumbled across a scene that would ignite a fresh wave of shock and controversy. Deep in a secluded patch of forest near Mineral, partially obscured by brush and fallen logs, lay a human skeleton. Clothing fragments and personal effects identified the remains immediately. It was Mike Reimer. The discovery was at once relieving and horrifying. He wasn't alive, he hadn't run off, nor had he started a new life. But the circumstances of his death were anything but clear. The skeleton bore no obvious trauma. No bullet holes, no stab wounds, nothing that could definitively say he had been murdered. The forensic limitations of the early 1990s meant that investigators could not perform the sophisticated analyses we have today. But one fact was undeniable: Mike had died in the wilderness, alone, and it was impossible to tell whether it had been violence, accident, or something more sinister. Theories erupted like wildfire. Some argued this confirmed he had been a victim all along, murdered by the same person who killed Diana. Others maintained that his death was convenient, a macabre punctuation that cemented the narrative of his guilt. After all, in the eyes of the public, Mike Reimer had been the vanishing husband, the man everyone either feared or mourned. His sudden appearance as a skeleton allowed for endless speculation. Had he been trapped? Lured? Silenced? Or was this simply a tragic accident? The discovery also reignited questions about the tube sock killer's identity. Could the same person have killed Mike, or was this an unrelated incident, a coincidence that simply added another layer to the horror? Some law enforcement officials cautiously admitted that it could be linked, citing the isolated location as a signature of the previous crimes. Others remained non-committal, insisting that there was no direct evidence to tie his death to the original murders. But the timing and location were impossible to ignore. Mineral had long been a theater of terror, and the woods themselves seemed complicit, swallowing secrets and refusing to give them back. Mike's body lying in a remote forest patch mirrored the very pattern that had terrified the community for years: a loved one vanishing into the shadows, a tragic death discovered long after the fact, leaving questions, fear, and unresolved grief behind. The public reaction was immediate and polarized. Some mourned Mike as a victim, the husband wronged by fate and possibly by the killer who had haunted the forests for years. Others treated the discovery with grim satisfaction, convinced that justice, of some ambiguous sort, had been meted out. Debate over his guilt or innocence filled local papers, radio call-in shows, and community gatherings. For many, the ambiguity was worse than the certainty of murder. It suggested that even after years, the truth might never come to light. Adding fuel to the fire, a peculiar piece of evidence surfaced from the site. Among the remains was a single, white tube sock, partially hidden under a log near where the skeleton lay. Investigators were baffled. Had the killer returned, leaving his signature years later? Was it planted to mislead investigators, or did it serve some ritualistic purpose? For the community, it was proof enough that the killer had a hold on the forest that no one could challenge. Even in death, the lines between victim and perpetrator blurred. This revelation gave rise to the most controversial theory yet. What if Mike Reimer had been both victim and participant? Some conspiracy theorists proposed that he may have been involved in criminal activities, perhaps coerced by the real killer, only to meet his own grisly fate later. Others claimed that law enforcement had ignored critical evidence linking him to a broader criminal network. The debates were relentless, spilling into every corner of the community. Families who had already suffered through the deaths of their loved ones were forced to relive the pain all over again. Diana's parents were haunted anew by the thought that the man they had mourned for years, Mike, might have been a complex figure, neither wholly innocent nor entirely guilty. Crystal, now a young girl entering adolescence, carried the weight of her parents' history, growing up under the shadow of speculation and fear. The discovery of Mike's body also reignited national interest. True crime magazines and television programs revisited the case, framing it as one of the most enigmatic unsolved mysteries in Washington's history. Commentators debated the implications endlessly. Could the tube sock killer still be alive? Had he struck again, or had Mike's death finally ended the cycle of terror? And yet, in the forests themselves, the truth remained silent. The tube socks were still there, if only in memory. The shadows remained dense and impenetrable. The woods, it seemed, had claimed Mike as surely as they had claimed the other victims, refusing to reveal whether he was innocent, guilty, or simply unfortunate. By the end of the decade, the tube sock killings had become a legend, not just for the murders themselves, but for the unanswered questions, the scandal, and the conspiracy that surrounded them. Mike Reimer's skeleton was proof that even the vanished could return in unexpected ways, yet still leave more mysteries than answers. Mineral and the surrounding towns remained haunted. The forests had become a ghostly theater of unresolved fear, a place where tragedy and speculation intertwined. And somewhere, perhaps, the real killer, the man who had left the tube socks, orchestrated the murders, and manipulated the shadows, might still be walking free. In the end, the ghost of the woods wasn't just Mike Reimer. It was the lingering horror that none of this would ever be fully understood, the certainty that the forest still held secrets, and the chilling realization that evil could hide quietly among the trees, patient, observant, and invisible. By the early 1990s, the forests of Mineral, Washington, had already earned their reputation as places of fear. Long after the bodies were found, after the tube socks became a haunting symbol, the region had transformed from a quiet logging town into a landscape of whispered speculation and unresolved terror. For those who had lived through it, the tube sock killings were more than a series of murders. They were an indelible mark on the community, a puzzle that refused to be solved, and a scandal that refused to die. Even with Mike Reimer's skeletal remains discovered years after his disappearance, the mystery only deepened. Was he a victim of the killer, or had he participated in acts that remain forever hidden? Was the tube sock found near his remains a cruel joke, a signature, or a warning? No evidence could definitively answer these questions. Every forensic test, every report, every lead seemed to vanish as quickly as it appeared, leaving only fragments of what might have been the truth. Families of the victims continued to struggle with grief. Crystal Robertson, now a teenager, carried the shadow of her parents' tragedy with her, navigating a world in which her father's innocence or guilt remained unresolved. Friends of Stephen Harkins and Ruth Cooper wrestled with the same haunting question: could justice ever truly be served? The case files, hundreds of pages thick, contained only a record of absence, speculation, and fear. Locals still whisper of sightings in the woods. Hunters talk about fleeting figures between the trees, the flicker of headlights along logging roads where no one should be. Even decades later, the forests seem alive with the memory of what happened, as if the trees themselves hold on to secrets that no investigator, no journalist, and no curious visitor can uncover. What makes the tube sock killings particularly chilling is the perfect combination of randomness and pattern. The victims were seemingly ordinary couples, engaging in everyday activities, weekend drives, trips to the woods, time spent together in a world they believed was safe. Yet each murder displayed a disturbing consistency: violence, isolation, and the signature tube sock. The ordinary transformed into horror. The mundane became terrifying. It's a fact that still unnerves anyone who drives through the backroads of Pierce and Lewis counties, imagining that someone, or something, could strike again. The case is also a cautionary tale of trust and betrayal. The scandal surrounding the investigation, the missing evidence, the theories of law enforcement corruption, the whispers of criminal activity in the forests, added layers of fear beyond the acts of murder themselves. In Mineral, the idea that a killer might have been aided by silence or negligence within the authorities made the terror personal. No one could feel fully safe. No one could know if the man next door was friend, foe, or something far more dangerous. Over the years, amateur sleuths and true crime enthusiasts have attempted to piece together the story. They have analyzed patterns, scoured old reports, revisited crime scenes, and debated theories online and in print. Some believe the killer may still be alive, quietly living somewhere in Washington, hidden among ordinary townsfolk, or perhaps even having moved far from the forests where his crimes began. Others argue the case is effectively closed, that the deaths were the work of a single individual who likely died unknown and unapprehended. Even modern forensic technology has failed to yield definitive answers. DNA testing, advanced ballistics, and digital reconstruction offer tantalizing possibilities, but without a suspect or a confession, the evidence cannot speak for itself. The tube sock killings remain, legally and culturally, an unsolved case, a puzzle that frustrates, terrifies, and fascinates. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of all is the human element, the victims. Each person who disappeared or was murdered had a story, a life interrupted, and a family left behind. The brutality of the acts, combined with the bizarre signature, leaves a lingering question: what compels a human being to commit such calculated violence? Why couples? Why tube socks? And why in the remote forests of Washington, where isolation made detection easier and justice slower? These questions have no answers, and in their absence, fear and speculation fill the void. Even decades later, Mineral is never quite the same. Every new resident is warned, every hiker told to remain vigilant. The forests carry an almost mythical reputation. And in homes where families once thought safety was guaranteed, the story of the tube sock killer is a lesson in uncertainty, an ever-present reminder that evil does not always announce itself, and that monsters sometimes walk silently among the living. For true crime observers, this case serves as both caution and fascination. The tube sock killings demonstrate the intersection of violence, mystery, and human psychology. They illustrate how patterns, seemingly trivial details, and the quirks of geography can all converge to create a legacy that haunts a community. And for the families affected, the story is not about fascination, it is about the absence of closure, the absence of justice, and the unresolved horror of knowing that someone took lives and left them to question whether the perpetrator was ever caught, or even caught at all. The tube sock killer may never be identified. The forests of Mineral may forever conceal the truth. And yet, the story endures. It refuses to die because, in every whispered conversation, every cautious step through the woods, every new visitor aware of the legend, the tube sock killings live on. They are part of the landscape, part of the culture, part of the cautionary tale of a community that learned too late that terror can wear an ordinary mask. In the end, the tube sock killings are not just a story of murder. They are a story of mystery, scandal, and unanswered questions. They are a reminder that evil can be patient, meticulous, and invisible, and that sometimes, the most chilling stories are those that refuse to end. Mineral, Washington, and its surrounding forests will always remember. And so will the world.